For this part of our lectures on Niccolo Machiavelli, let's talk about his ideas found in his other famous book, The Discourses. In this book, what we can say is, or uh, we can describe it as a Republican theory and civic virtue. There is actually an alternative path over monarchy, and that is, for Machiavelli, republicanism. As Machiavelli's hopes of returning to active government service faded through, let's say, on the 1510s and the 1520s, he focused increasingly on a literary and intellectual life. He became involved with a discussion group of humanists and literary figures that met in the gardens of Cosimo Rucellai on the outskirts of Florence. From these discussions and his research into classical texts emerged the Discourses, a work approximately 4 times the length of the Prince. The Discourses is simultaneously a commentary on the first 10 books of Livy's history of Rome and Machiavelli's familiar themes: how states rise and fall, how they preserve liberty, and what conditions ensure political and military success. Machiavelli takes evident pride in his approach to these themes through historical material. Machiavelli takes evident pride in the discourses because he believes that this is a text coming out alive from history itself. He moves easily between ancient Rome and Renaissance Italy, reflecting his conviction that history demonstrates timeless lessons about human behavior and political affairs. The striking feature of the discourses is that it reveals a markedly more favorable disposition toward a republican regime than the prince might suggest. Indeed, many scholars argue that the prince should be understood in light of the discourses rather than vice versa, with the prince being viewed as a particular application to Italy of the principles set forth in the longer work. When it comes to reconciling the apparent contradiction, the apparent conflict between the prince's apparent monarchism in the discourses and republicanism uh, has troubled interpreters. You see, in the prince, somehow Machiavelli is advocating for monarchy, a monarchical form of regime, while in the discourses, Machiavelli is certainly advocating for a more republican government. And this has basically troubled some interpreters. Yet, this conflict may be less fundamental than it appears. The two works address different subjects and circumstances. The prince discusses the establishment and consolidation of monarchical power, particularly under the conditions facing a new prince. The discourses following Livy concerns republics and the conditions under which they flourish. Moreover, despite some minor tensions, the two works present a generally consistent political vision. Both emphasize the centrality of military power, the importance of virtue, which is understood as the capacity for effective action, the dangers of internal corruption, and the lessons of history. Both reject utopian schemes divorced from political reality. Both insist on facing uncomfortable truths about human nature and political necessity. Furthermore, Machiavelli makes clear that much of the prince's analysis applies to republics as well as monarchies. In chapter 2 of The Prince, Machiavelli mentions that he will not discuss republics, having treated them elsewhere, presumably referring to the discourses. Machiavelli believed in the superiority of a republican regime or a republican government. However, he makes it clear his preference for republican over monarchical regime in the discourses. This preference follows from his military analysis because effective defense requires a powerful native army, and because native armies require that citizens be armed. Republics possess a military advantage over principalities for citizens to accept being armed and serving in military campaigns. They must perceive some benefit to it. They must possess a degree of political liberty and the opportunity to participate in governance. Furthermore, if the citizenry is to be armed and possess political liberty, they must develop a commitment to the public good rather than private interest. What Machiavelli terms civic virtue, the characteristic vice opposing civic virtue is corruption, which centers on concern for one's own good rather than the state's. This represents perhaps the most important distinction between a republican government and tyranny in Machiavelli's analysis. A free republic can harness the energy and commitment of its population in ways a tyranny can never do. Now, let's talk about civic virtue and the common good. As we can see from both, the Prince and the Discourses, most especially the Discourses. This brings us to one of Machiavelli's most sophisticated concepts, civic virtue. In the Discourses, the virtue which Machiavelli is primarily concerned is that of the people rather than individual rulers. Unlike the virtue of the prince, which centers on the prince's capacity for effective action, regardless of moral considerations, civic virtue in the discourses refers to the population's or the people's commitment to the common good, their willingness to sacrifice private interest for the benefit of the state. The attributes Machiavelli associates with civic virtue can be identified through the example of Republican Rome during its rise to power and hegemony. Roman citizens were courageous and willing to make severe sacrifices for the common good. They displayed public spiritedness, constancy, and willingness to endure hardship. The opposite of civic virtue, which is corruption, involves citizens pursuing private gain at the expense of the common good, seeking to enrich themselves through nepotism, faction. Machiavelli contrasts the virtue of Republican Rome with the corruption of the Italian cities of his day. Just merely historical. It carries clear implications for Machiavelli. If Italy could recover civic virtue, if citizens could be inspired to sacrifice for the common good rather than pursuing private faction and interests, then Italian republics could achieve the power and glory Rome had demonstrated. However, there might be conflict in a republican regime. And This conflict may serve a purpose for the strengthening of the Republican regime itself. One of Machiavelli's most original contributions to political theory concerns the role of internal conflict in Republican stability. This reverses the conventional wisdom of his time. Medieval and humanist political theorists believed that internal harmony and the absence of discord were essential to good governance. Conflict between different social groups was viewed as a disease to be healed. Machiavelli argues the opposite. He notes that Rome succeeded not despite conflict between plebeians and senators, but precisely because of it. This conflict was the primary cause of Roman liberty. The contests between nobles and common people, rather than undermining the republic, forced compromises and institutional arrangements that protected liberty. Um, Machiavelli wrote, he says, I must say that it appears to me that those who condemn the disturbances cause of, and that they give more consideration to the noises and cries arising from such disturbances than to the good effects they produced. Nor do they consider that in every republic there are two different tendencies, that of the people and that of the upper class, and that all of the laws which are passed in favor of liberty are born from the rift between the two. This observation reflects Machiavelli's broader understanding of human nature. People's baser inclinations, like greed, ambition, desire, the healthy channels of into competition within legal frameworks, rather than attempting to eliminate them. Conflict becomes the engine of institutional development and the protection of liberty itself. Another important idea that could be seen from Machiavelli's The Discourses is the cycle of regimes and historical change. The Discourses presents a cyclical view of political theory. Machiavelli believes that regimes naturally progress through stages, from disorder to monarchy to tyranny, and eventually back to disorder before the cycle recommences. This cyclical pattern reflects the unchanging nature of human behavior and desire. Because human nature remains constant, similar patterns of political development will recur as circumstances recur. A central aim of statecraft is to slow this cycle as much as possible, to maintain one's state and build a glorious reputation. Security depends on power relative to potential rivals. In a world of constant struggle, the close relationship between political and military affairs that Machiavelli emphasizes throughout his works becomes paramount. So, what are the conditions for Republican greatness? For a republic to achieve greatness, several conditions must be satisfied. First, The citizen body must possess civic virtue, a commitment to the common good over private faction. Second, the republic must maintain a powerful military establishment, preferably composed of citizen soldiers. Third, religion must be cultivated as a force supporting civic virtue and public spiritedness. Fourth, laws and institutions must be designed to channel inevitable conflicts toward the protection of liberty rather than the accumulation of private power. Machiavelli takes an essentially instrumental view of religion. He does not argue that the republic should promote religious truth. Rather, he argues that rulers should promote genuine religious adherence because religion powerfully reinforces civic virtue. Roman religion, with its emphasis on honor, courage, and greatness, fostered the martial virtues necessary for military success. Christian religion, on the other hand, with its emphasis on humility, otherworldliness, and contempt for earthly things, undermines the civic virtues necessary for a republican greatness. Machiavelli argues that this judgment about religion's utility is independent of whether religious beliefs in question are true. Let me read it to you. He said, the rulers of a republic or a kingdom must therefore uphold the foundations of the religion they profess. And having done this, they will find it an easy matter for them to maintain a devout republic, and as a consequence, one that is good and united. Even those they judge to be false, and the more they have to do so, the more prudent they are, and the more knowledgeable about natural phenomena. These represents perhaps the most explicit statement of Machiavelli's instrumental approach to morals and religious values. Whatever serves the state's power and glory should be supported. Whatever undermines these ends should be opposed. Truth value is secondary to political utility.